Can a Christian drink alcohol? Are we, as followers of Christ, people who are allowed to have a couple beers with our buddy, have a couple glasses of wine? Do we as Christians have to totally abstain from alcohol? Is that what the Bible commands of us? That's the topic today on the podcast. I'm your host, Nick Nolfi, and this is the Catholic OCD Podcast. Alcohol is a very debated topic in the Christian world. You can have people who, they can claim to be very, very devout Christians, and they could almost be a drunkard. And then you have people who claim to be very devout Christians, and they don't drink alcohol at all, and they think that if you do, that, you're going to hell. So what does the Bible exactly say about alcohol for Christians? I can remember I grew up in the first 12 years of my life. I went to the Church of the Nazarene. That's where my family went. It was very Wesleyan. It was very much a holiness church. So it was very much understood that we as Christians do not drink alcohol. Many of the people in leadership or even on the church board were demanded not to have any alcohol in order to hold a position of authority in the church. Even when my family left the Nazarene church and we went to the Assemblies of God church, you really saw that it was emphasized really not to have alcohol. Pretty much all the pastors that I knew would never have a beer. Most of the people there, and these churches would just basically think that, like, this is not something that you do. I think that one of the issues when it comes to alcohol is that it is a visible thing. So, example, if you're battling inside your mind hatred, jealousy, unforgiveness, lustful thoughts, these are things that nobody else knows that you're dealing with these. It's not something that just tattooed on your forehead. But if you're in a restaurant and you're drinking a beer and maybe a fellow Christian from your church comes in or the pastor comes in and you're standing there with a beer, sitting there with a beer, well, this is a visible thing that you are choosing to engage in drinking alcohol. When I was about 24 years old and I converted to Catholicism. Now, listen, I'm somebody who, as a younger person, I definitely was known to have a beer or two, or 10. But still, in the church world, it was something that I wasn't familiar with, seeing pastors or leaders in the church drink alcohol. When I converted to Catholicism, we had a church dinner, and after church, when we went to this church dinner in the hall, I remember seeing our priest stand there. He had his black suit on, his white collar, stand there, and he was drinking a Pabst Blue Ribbon. So out of all the beers, something like somebody from the Dukes of Hazzard would drink, he's sitting there drinking a Pabst Blue Ribbon. And I just remember kind of being taken back by it and thinking to myself, wow, like, this priest is here and he's drinking beer in front of everybody. And it was something that was just so different from the way I grew up. Now, obviously, I think the priest had one beer, and of course, nobody else made a big deal about it, but I just remember it stuck in my head. And part of that is because I think that even as an American, we are very much highly influenced by the Puritan movement. So I think that the idea of the Christian who can't have any alcohol, I believe it really is an American thing. You would even hear of pastors from our churches, Protestant churches, who did not drink alcohol, who maybe would go on a missions trip to some European country, maybe even England. And if they went out with other pastors for lunch, all of those other pastors, these, English or Irish or Scottish or whatever pastors, they would go to the restaurant and they would all order, a beer with their meal. And you would hear of these American, more modern evangelical Christians saying like how it was kind of like a culture shock to them. So the question is, what does the Bible itself actually say about drinking alcohol? So a couple things I want to go through is, first I want to give a couple of the positive verses for drinking alcohol. Now we know that St. Paul talks about, he encourages people, when you have an upset stomach, don't just try to drink water, but have some wine. Have some wine to settle your stomach. In Psalm 104, it says, God has given us wine that gladdens the heart of man. Proverbs says, give strong drink to the one who is perishing, and wine to those in bitter distress. So there are more verses, especially in the Old Testament, that really talk about alcohol being not something that's tolerated by God, but something that actually is a gift from God that we can enjoy. When it talks about the person who's dying, give him strong drink, we can understand this as, somebody who's in great pain, as their life is passing, maybe from an illness or some disease that they have. So give them some strong drink. Even though it talks about distress, people going through distress to calm their nerves, to have a little bit of alcohol, have some wine. This is something that's given from the earth as a gift from God. When you look at Jesus' first public miracle, in Jesus' first public miracle, he takes water and he makes it into wine for a wedding feast. Now, some people will try to say, oh yeah, but that was unfermented wine. No, it's not. There are two different words for wine. One means unfermented, one means fermented. This was a fermented wine. Another way that you know this is the host of the wedding actually comes, or somebody goes up to the host of the wedding, because this is after they ran out of wine. Somebody went up to the host of the wedding and said, usually the host of the wedding brings the good wine out first. And then when people have had too much to drink, then you bring out the cheaper wine. But he said, you have saved the best wine for last. What does this mean? If you have one glass of wine that's a kind of a crappy wine, it tastes crappy. The second glass of that same wine, it starts to go down a little bit smoother. And so what these people would do is they would bring out the best tasting wine first. When everybody's palate was clean and they could really taste the exact flavors of the wine, they would bring this out first. And then when people had too much, then they would bring out the cheaper wine. This is what Jesus makes. He makes fermented wine for a wedding celebration where people weren't having one glass. They were probably having a couple glasses. And this miracle is the miracle that Jesus does at the request of his mother that really catapults him into his 3-year ministry of miracle working. Now, with that all being said, about the Bible talking about how wine is from the earth, and when God created the earth, everything he saw was good. Jesus makes wine. The Bible clearly talks about giving wine to people in distress. It's a gift from God. But at the same time, there is a great danger when it comes to drinking in excess. And it's not just a danger for your health or that you might get a DUI, or that you might even accidentally kill somebody. It's a danger for your eternal soul. So a couple verses I want to read is, number one, I want to talk about St. Paul. St. Paul in Ephesians, he has a saying. He says that, do not get drunk on wine that leads to debauchery. So what does Paul mean by this? We all have to wrestle with the desires of our flesh. Even when we have the love of Christ poured into our hearts, we still battle certain desires of the flesh. You could see Paul wrestling with this in Romans, where he talks about the good things that I want to do, I don't do. The bad things I don't want to do, I do. We wrestle with the flesh. But it's very important to fight this great battle. The battles of lust, the battles of anger, wrath, of getting in a fight. There's a lot of things that we have to battle in the flesh. Having control over that is something that you can only really try to do when you're sober. And this is why Peter warns about, staying sober. But what Paul's saying here is that when you get drunk, even getting drunk itself can be a mortal sin. But not only that, but when you get drunk, you can fall into these temptations of the flesh that maybe you would not fall into if you had control. So you could picture if you're somebody's battling lust, it might be something that they think about, something that they struggle with, but they try to have control over this. Yet you get drunk, and maybe the sober you wouldn't engage in some of the stuff, but the drunk you would. So when we get drunk, what we do is we really unleash the desires of the flesh. We lose control over it. It's kind of like, giving your flesh kryptonite, or giving your control kryptonite, and allowing your flesh to just really rule you with desire. And this is why Paul warns us. He says that getting drunk leads to debauchery. It leads to indulging in these desires of the flesh. The Bible is also very clear that leaders, whether you're a civil leader or a religious leader, we are not supposed to, or those people are not supposed to be people who drink too much alcohol. It's something that is advised against in the scriptures. Also, Paul gives warnings about older women being good examples of holiness to younger women. And don't be a bad example by, being addicted to drink. The Bible talks also about how alcohol can make you violent. It can make you want to fight. It can make your anger come out. I think any of us who've experienced over drinking might have had one or two occasions when that has happened. So when you end up living in this lifestyle of drunkenness, then what you're doing is you're really giving up your control. You're giving up really on the fight against the flesh. There is a battle that goes on in us. There is this great fight that we have where, while we know in our hearts that we want God and we know, we should serve him and we should really, really live this life of holiness, there are these great desires of the flesh that are constantly driving us and constantly trying to control us. That control of mastering these virtues, of temperance, really, temperance of, everything in moderation and self-control. When you give yourself over to a lifestyle of drunkenness, you're really giving up on the fight. and you're really just handing the car keys over to the desires of your flesh. And this is why St. Paul talks about in Corinthians, in this warning of a lot of different types of sinful natures or sinful lifestyles that will not enter the kingdom of heaven. He says, don't let anybody fool you, but drunkards will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, how can being drunk, how can it be considered mortal sin or venial sin? When does it become mortal sin? When is it just venial sin? So we know that in order for something to be mortal sin, it must consist of three different things. It must be sin of grave matter, which being drunk is. It must, we must know that it's a sin of grave matter, which now you do if you've listened to this podcast. And number three, we have to be in the free state of mind to engage in this. So let's say somebody says, hey, you guys want to go out to eat tonight? Yeah, we'll go out. And you say, I'm probably going to get a couple glasses of wine with my dinner. And the second glass tasted really good, so you get a third. That tasted really good. So then you get a fourth, you get a fifth, and then before you know it, you're drunk. Well, it could be argued that this person did not set out with the intent to get drunk. They weren't really realizing that they were getting drunk, and that this would be sin, and this would definitely at least be venial sin. But in this situation, it might not fall into the category of mortal sin. But let's say you're like, hey, man, what are you doing tonight? Oh, nothing. What are you doing? Dude, I don't know. Let's just get hammered tonight. When you, in that state, you're in a free state of mind, it's a grave sin, you know it's grave sin. When you then go enter into that, then that is mortal sin. At this point, in this drunkenness, especially if you're planning it out and you're handing yourself over to the fight and you're just saying, hey, I'm letting my flesh win, you're rejecting the charity, the virtue of charity that was poured into you. At this point, you should, at minimum, be cut off from communion. And you have to understand, this is a very hard battle that we have to go through in life. Jesus talks about in Luke, strive for the narrow gate. Many try to enter. Only few do. Strive for it. When you hand yourself over to drunkenness, you're almost giving up. Now, there is an argument when it comes to then, where does free will come into play when somebody has already developed a physical addiction? And obviously, that's a very complicated matter. But with that being said, we have to understand that this is grave sins and a grave sin. And we can't think, especially just because we're Catholic. And sometimes, honestly, I think that drunkenness and probably swearing, sometimes, and whether it's fair or not, and it might not even be fair, but these are visible sins. So I hear a lot of people like, you can give the greatest arguments for the truth of the Catholic Church, but to them, they view the Catholics who get drunk all the time, and they think, oh, well, that's what Catholics do. And obviously, that's not a fair assessment, because somebody else could be battling all these other sins in their mind and stuff like that. It's just not visible. But it's kind of like Charles Barkley said, I didn't ask to be a role model. And you might not have asked to be a Catholic role model, but if you're claiming the name Catholic, you are a role model, whether you like it or not. This is something very serious to consider, but yeah, definitely listening to this, make a commitment, no more drunkenness. It really is something that will really hinder your growth in the faith, and it's something that we really got to reject. At the same time, if you see somebody having a glass of wine or a Pabst Blue Ribbon, don't judge them, because it's a gift. Have a couple drinks. It's a gift from God. Don't get drunk. That's a temptation from Satan. All right, guys. Thanks for watching. I'm Nick Nolfi. This is the Catholic OCD Podcast.